Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. 3 6-year-old children are among the victims being laid to rest in Newtown, Connecticut today as a result of a mass shooting that's renewed debate over gun violence and gun control laws in the US. The children were among 26 students and adults who died last Friday when 20-year-old Adam Lanza opened fire at an elementary school. Authorities believe the gunman killed his mother before driving to the school where he eventually took his own life. But investigators are still trying to determine a motive. Just yesterday, President Barack Obama called for Congress to reinstate an assault weapons ban that lapsed in 2004. He also named Vice President Joe Biden to lead an effort to write a set of concrete proposals to address gun violence. Meanwhile, a poll released yesterday indicates that the mass shooting has led to a shift in views on gun laws in the US. The CNN International poll says 52% of those surveyed favoured major restrictions on guns or making all guns illegal. Much has been made of the mental state of the gunman and whether there were enough provisions in place to help him. What is the link between mental health provision and gun crime? Britain itself has seen its own mass shootings in recent years, with massacres in Cumbria and Dunblane. They led directly to tighter restrictions on gun control laws. Can the same happen in the US? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined on the line by Ken Hurst, who's chairman and co-owner of TNT Multimedia Limited. He's also a journalist who's researched gun control law. We hope to be joined later by our bureaus in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Ken, thank you very much for joining us here on The Voice of Russia. Obviously, the parallels with massacres in Britain are often drawn by the media, but can we really compare them?
Well, I think we probably all understand that there's a unique culture in the US, Brendan, unique indeed in the industrialized world in terms of its the looseness, if one can put it that way, of its gun laws. So there are cultural differences. But yes, I think we can draw some comparisons and, most importantly, surely learn some lessons for our country where gun control, at least at the moment, is not entirely out of control.
But I guess in the United Kingdom, I'm thinking of the 2 most recent tragedies, the Cumbria shootings on the 2nd of June 2010. Derek Bird, he was a lone gunman. He killed 12 people and he injured 11 others. And also in 1996, there was the Dunblane massacre where Thomas Hamilton killed 16 children and 1 adult before committing suicide, turning the gun on himself. But they led directly to tougher gun controls, didn't they?
Well, yes and no. We've also had more recently Michael Atherton in my own neck of the woods. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had shotgun killings, not on a mass scale, but certainly people turning the gun on their families and then on themselves. So, we do have these incidents. I think you've got to remember, we have, I say gun control isn't out of control here, but when I researched for a piece I wrote on this last year, we had 1.4 million shotguns in this country and another 450,000 guns of various other kinds. So close on 2 million legitimately held firearms of one sort or another in the country. So whatever controls we put in, they're clearly not enough.
But is that cause for concern? 2 million out of a population of 60 million, it's nothing compared to what they have in the United States, of course. And particularly hunting rifles or hunting guns, aren't they? Are they? Well, the vast majority of them, aren't they?
Well, certainly, you can do a lot of damage with a shotgun, not as much and not as rapidly as these awful repeater machine guns like those that have been used in the US massacre. But look at it this way. I did a little calculation on this. I'm a great football fan, and I go to my football club every other Saturday, and I look around, and there are about 26,000 people watching my football match in the Premiership on a Saturday afternoon. And I did a little calculation from the amount of licenses that there are in my part of the world, and I worked out that among that crowd of 26,000, there are 800 people with who you could say are gunmen. Actually, it's and they are mostly men, I have to say. Now, when you look at that, that's pretty scary. When I say there are 800, those 800 people probably have licenses or do have licenses for not just one gun, but 2 or 3 guns each. What on earth can be the need for that?
I'm going to bring in our guest from our Moscow studio, Vadim Kozulin, who is an expert on arms, and he's from the Moscow-based Center for Political Studies. Can you hear me, Vadim? Can you hear me, Vadim?
Yes, I hear you well.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, we hear that this week Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian Prime Minister, he reiterated his stance against the legalization and keeping of bearing arms in Russia. This was obviously in response to the shootings in the United States, and I understand that in Russia it's obviously got a lot of media coverage. Are the laws on gun control tough enough in Russia? And has Mr. Medvedev's statements shed any light over the wisdom of allowing greater access to guns for civilians?
Here in Russia, we have an ongoing discussion on guns laws, and it a bit corresponds to the events in the United States, but not directly. I would compare two countries. And the similarity is that we are the biggest arms producers in the world. I would give you some figures which will show you the scale of the problem. In 1980, there were only 200 companies in the world which manufactured small arms. Nowadays, 30 years later, we have 600 companies in the world who manufacture small arms, and half of these companies are located in the United States. So I see the roots of the problem exactly in the industry, because industry is looking for new markets, and the United States is obviously the biggest market in the world for small arms. As for Russia, we also have a huge industry for production of small arms, and they are also looking for markets, and the Russian market is the best one for Russian manufacturers. So we have a big gun lobby and a long and lasting discussion of this issue with some groups promoting the liberalization of the law, and some trying to limit the use of guns by civilians. According to present situation, Russians are allowed to have hunter rifles or sport rifles if they are sportsmen, or so-called non-lethal weapons, which are either air pistols or rubber bullet weapons. Today the discussion is around shotguns, whether it's visible to give the right to possess it for civilians or not. And Mr. Medvedev says no, it's not a good decision to provide such a right to Russian citizens.
So what Mr. Medvedev said this week, how is that going down amongst the Russian public? Are they agreeing with him? Is the media on his side? Or is he simply just reacting to a tragedy in the US that you can't compare? There's no parallel scenario potentially in Russia.
Obviously, based on the events in the United States, the general mood in the media and in civil community is against the liberalization of gun possession. But the situation is dynamic, and it changes frequently, and sometimes the gun lobby is quite successful, and they have some kind of support in Russian parliament. I would say that sometimes media plays well, I would say that media makes sometimes a bad role when covering the events which happen in United States, or we had similar events in Russia. Probably those people who plan to commit killings and suicide, they want to send a message to the society, and frequently mass media provides them such an opportunity to send this message. And some people who decide to follow this example, they realize that mass media will help them as well. So I guess that it's probably could be a good idea to sign a kind of a code of conduct in case of accidents like the one which happened in the United States.
And much was made of the mental condition of Adam Lanza, who opened fire. For more on that, we're joined in our Washington, D.C. studio with our presenter Rob Sachs and his guest, the President and CEO of Mental Health America, Wayne Lindstrom. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And wanted to pick up on that last point that we just heard from our Moscow guest, Vadim Kazulin, about these people who go out and do these atrocious acts, Dr. Lindstrom, and having their name glorified and knowing that they're going to be infamous for the rest of their lives. Everybody's going to know Adam Lanza. Everyone knows now James Holmes, the person who had the massacre in Aurora. There's been a call for media to not publish the names of these people, for them to say, you know what, if you do this heinous act, you will not go out and you will not be glorified in whatever way you want. Is there a role for the media in terms of shutting out that aspect of it, so that perhaps that could be preventing others from doing the same?
I could only speculate on that. I don't know that we have enough understanding and research relative to the dynamics with these kinds of mass shootings. Everybody seems to be jumping on the bandwagon around this particular case, making all kinds of inferences with a lack of data. There have been a lot of misreports, as we've learned more over time, about the Adam Stanza case. And I really would not want to speculate that this is all about somebody wanting to get attention. We know that those that have mental illness do not have an innate propensity to be violent, and I get concerned that that's kind of the conclusion that people want to jump to. And in this particular case, there's been reports of this young man having Asperger's syndrome, which is on the autism spectrum, which is a developmental disability, not a mental illness.
And thinking about that, a lot has been talked about this autism that Lanza had. And I've heard reports that say, well, that may make them more prone to being attacked, but not necessarily being an attacker, someone who, though, is having a hard time adjusting to social situations, someone who feels like an outsider. But he was being closely watched by his mother, and someone who really, from all what we can tell, was being looked after. Same with James Holmes in Aurora. He was seeking mental help. He was talking to a psychiatrist. What can be done if these two people were their problems were being diagnosed and they were seeking treatment? What else could have been done?
I wouldn't come to those conclusions based on the sketchy information that we have to date. We don't know whether or not Adam Stanza was appropriately diagnosed. We don't know if, in fact, he was getting treatment. We don't know if he was on medication. I saw one interview with an adult who was a babysitter earlier in life for Adam Stanza, who claimed that the mother warned him never to turn his back on Adam as a child, and to watch him at all times. And then we fast forward a decade or more, and we have a mother who's taking her son out on a shooting range and teaching him how to use these deadly weapons. And so there's some incongruencies here that are very difficult to make sense of. For somebody who's mentally ill or has a developmental disability, typically, if there's going to be any exhibition of violence, it's because there are other social determinants in the mix. Oftentimes, it's has a comorbidity, if you will, with some type of an addiction. And you are absolutely right when you talk about the children who are withdrawn, isolative, avoid eye contact, appear to their peers to be nerdish, etc. Many of these children are very bright. They do end up being victimized by other students. Some of it is social withdrawal, but worse, there's a lot of bullying that oftentimes goes on with these kids, too.
Well, President Obama has talked about setting up a task force to look at how we can improve looking after those with mental illness in the United States. Where do you think the most resources should go to perhaps finding someone who's going through these emotional difficulties before they turn violent?
Well, I'm a big believer in the public health model, and then public health begins with primary prevention. And we have enough science today to know about the neurophysiological development of children. And that 0 to 5 time frame of life is when kids neurophysiologically get hardwired to regulate. And if they're exposed to toxic level of stress, if they are traumatized. I don't know if you're familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was completed by the Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control in this country, that showed that children who have 3, 4, 5 of these adverse childhood experiences, that can be everything from experiencing the death of a parent, being abandoned by a parent, undergoing sexual, physical, emotional abuse as a child, etc., end up over the life course being 4 or 5, 6 times more likely to have a variety of chronic conditions, including mental illness, things like obesity, diabetes, heart disorders, etc. So getting back to your original question in terms of what is the most expedient thing to do, is for us to be able in this country to create supportive, safe, nurturing environments from children so that they get hardwired to regulate. If they have that kind of grounding early in life, they get to be in a place where when they are experiencing life stressors throughout the life course, they become resilient kids. They become problem solvers. They can handle life stressors. But kids that are hardwired in a way that puts them in a position of dysregulation, and on top of that are exposed to toxic stress environments, we set these kids up for failure.
I'd just like to bring in my guest Ken Hurst, who's a journalist who's researched gun control. Our guest in Washington there is talking about the nurturing required to ensure that the mental health of a nation, which could have some kind of impact on gun crime. But I suppose when we look at the British examples, for instance, was it ever really kind of unpicked, really got to the bottom of the mental state of the proponents of, say, the Hungerford Massacre, the Dunblane Massacre, of course, Derek Bird and the Cumbria shootings? And if they're hell-bent on killing, no amount of gun legislation will stop them because they're prepared to go out in a blaze of glory, so to speak.
Well, it's an interesting point that you make, Brendan, and unlike Wayne, I'm not a mental health expert, but it is interesting to start to just unpick a little the background to some of the people who've committed atrocities here. I remember the case of Tony Martin, who flipped on being confronted with a burglar and shot him while he was fleeing and was jailed for the same. We've had men who flipped because they've suddenly discovered that they've been cuckolded by an unfaithful wife. Or in Derek Bird's case, it appears he was shot to the tax authorities by his brother, which was the incident, which you'll forgive the awful pun, which triggered his terrible death fest in Cumbria. So, these people don't have "I am a madman" tattooed on their foreheads. It's very difficult, as Wayne says, to ascertain who is mentally ill and who is motivated to kill by that mental illness. On the other hand, the authorities make mistakes too. I was looking at the case of Michael Atherton in Durham. Now, Michael Atherton threatened to shoot himself 3 years before he finally got round to it, and he was so, his family was so concerned about his mental health that they actually reported him to Durham police in 2008, and his 6 weapons, again I come back to the point, 6 weapons, who needs the licensing of 6 weapons, were temporarily confiscated.
So are you suggesting a kind of alarm bell should be raised if somebody has more than one weapon? If they're getting a collection of weapons, there should be some kind of they shouldn't be allowed to slip through the net.
Well, it is a bit of a side issue, but I do wonder if there are, obsessive collectors of weapons who'd be better off actually collecting postage stamps. It is a slightly odd thing to collect, in my view. But just going back to this point, here's a guy who was concern was expressed, his family quite caring about his mental health, reported him, the police took away, confiscated his weapons, and then he appealed. gave them back, and not long later, shot his partner and two of her family members and took them into oblivion with him. So, there are no easy answers to this, but I think we have to be very careful that a presidential examination of mental welfare, isn't something that kicks this issue of licensing of guns into the long grass, because it has all the makings of that, in my view.
Our guest in Moscow, Vadim Kozulin, who's an expert on arms. In Russia, private possession of handguns and any type of automatic weapon is banned outright, isn't it? And the procedure to get, say, a hunting rifle is quite difficult. But people are somehow getting around that. Is that true?
Yes, there is such a problem. The laws on possession of guns and even hunting or sport weapons is very strict. But the problem is that they are, I would say, easily avoided. And many people who shouldn't have such a right and shouldn't possess these weapons, they find the way to possess it. But still, the laws are quite strict, and I can say that those who illegally possess a weapon or even a cartridge can be imprisoned for 2 years, can be sentenced for 2 years of imprisonment. The numbers of accidents with weapons are probably not so numerous as in the United States, and the number of psychs who take part in them also is not so big. The recent example which comes to my mind was a serial killing by a person who actually was a policeman, head of a unit, a promising young policeman in the rank of a major, if I'm not mistaken, and he killed a dozen of people being just drunk. So the mental illness is not, I would say, is not a big problem in relation to misuse of weapons. I suppose that much bigger problem represent alcohol and drug addicts. That's real threats in our country, and it's noticed by Russian leaders, and they try to make the legislation in respect of drunk people who are driving cars or carrying weapons stricter.
Okay, back to our studio in Washington.
Well, if I could just jump in. Sure, thank you. And Dr. Lindstrom, thinking about that, thinking about making sure that whoever does possess a weapon is mentally fit for it, how do we suss out you pass the test, you don't pass the test? It doesn't seem like there's one litmus test for mentally stable to own a gun or not mentally stable to own a gun.
Well, you're absolutely correct. And to segue with my Russian colleague, there are things like addiction, for example, that certainly can affect one's behavior. And I don't know if you remember, in this country, it must be 25 years ago now, we had a former Marine sniper on the University Tower at the University of Texas who killed a number of people. And that gentleman had gone to provider after provider, mental health providers, as well as healthcare providers, saying, I have these thoughts of hurting someone, of killing someone. That isn't like me. There's something very wrong with me. And no one could assess that there was anything out of the ordinary with him. And after he was killed that day, they did an autopsy and found that he had a brain tumor on that section of the brain that controls violent behavior. So when you talk about being able to assess, and this is one of the problems we have when it comes to children, we don't have enough comprehensive assessment capability to do good neuropsych workups to determine exactly how much of this is mental illness, developmental disability associated, or can be physical and neurological as well. So when you talk about some kind of test, etc., for a propensity for violence, etc., we're a long way from having that capability.
And that gets into a whole philosophical question, too. If there's a tumor in someone's brain that is affecting their cognitive reasoning and their, making them having a tendency to do things that they wouldn't normally do if that tumor wasn't there, how much should we be punishing those people because they are suffering from some type of mental defect that maybe could be solved if that tumor was removed?
That's probably a question for a medical ethicist as opposed to myself. It does pose a dilemma for us as societies when these kinds of cases present themselves.
Brendan Cole?
Well, yes. So the much to be considered in the United States in the coming weeks. Ken Hurst, just quickly. What can we see some kind of immediate reaction from the United Kingdom? Gun laws need to be strengthened in your view, don't they?
Yes, they do. And sadly, looking at the reactions from government and from people like the Countryside Alliance to previous shootings, reaction has been we mustn't have a knee-jerk reaction. If we took the guns away, people would arm themselves with knives. I just don't buy any of that, quite frankly. And if that's the official response to the killings we've had in this country, I don't hold out too much hope for stronger gun laws, although personally I can see no justification for the private ownership of lethal weapons.
Well, that's Ken Hurst, chairman and co-owner of TNT Multimedia Limited and journalist who's researched gun control, speaking to me there. And on the line from Moscow, Vadim Kazulin, expert on arms and from the Moscow-based Center for Political Studies. And in Washington, D.C., with our presenter Rob Sachs, was the president and CEO of Mental Health America, Dr. Wayne Lindstrom. Coming up after the news break, Tim Eckott is in conversation with Trenton Oldfield, the man who disrupted the annual rowing race. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. 3 6-year-old children are among the victims being laid to rest in Newtown, Connecticut today as a result of a mass shooting that's renewed debate over gun violence and gun control laws in the US. The children were among 26 students and adults who died last Friday when 20-year-old Adam Lanza opened fire at an elementary school. Authorities believe the gunman killed his mother before driving to the school where he eventually took his own life. But investigators are still trying to determine a motive. Just yesterday, President Barack Obama called for Congress to reinstate an assault weapons ban that lapsed in 2004. He also named Vice President Joe Biden to lead an effort to write a set of concrete proposals to address gun violence. Meanwhile, a poll released yesterday indicates that the mass shooting has led to a shift in views on gun laws in the US. The CNN International poll says 52% of those surveyed favoured major restrictions on guns or making all guns illegal. Much has been made of the mental state of the gunman and whether there were enough provisions in place to help him. What is the link between mental health provision and gun crime? Britain itself has seen its own mass shootings in recent years, with massacres in Cumbria and Dunblane. They led directly to tighter restrictions on gun control laws. Can the same happen in the US? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined on the line by Ken Hurst, who's chairman and co-owner of TNT Multimedia Limited. He's also a journalist who's researched gun control law. We hope to be joined later by our bureaus in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Ken, thank you very much for joining us here on The Voice of Russia.
0.4 million shotguns in this country and another 450,000 guns of various other kinds. So close on 2 million legitimately held firearms of one sort or another in the country. So whatever controls we put in, they're clearly not enough.
But is that cause for concern? I mean, 2 million out of a population of 60 million, it's nothing compared to what they have in the United States, of course. And particularly hunting rifles or hunting guns, aren't they? I mean, are they? Well, the vast majority of them, aren't they?
Well, there's certainly, you can do a lot of damage with a shotgun, not as much and not as rapidly as these awful repeater machine guns like those that have been used in the US massacre. But look at it this way. I did a little count.
10 Derek Bird, he was a lone gunman. He killed 12 people and he injured 11 others. And also in 1996, there was the Dunblane massacre where Thomas Hamilton killed 16 children and 1 adult before committing suicide, turning the gun on himself. But they led directly and to tougher gun controls, didn't they?
Well, yes and no. We've also had more recently Michael Atherton in my own neck of the woods. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had shotgun killings, not on a mass scale, but certainly people turning the gun on their families and then on themselves. So, we do have these incidents. I think you've got to remember, we have, I say gun control isn't out of control here, but when I researched for a piece I wrote on this last year, we had one...
Obviously, the parallels with massacres in Britain are often drawn by the media, but can we really compare them?
Well, I think we probably all understand that there's a unique culture in the US, Brendan, unique indeed in the industrialized world in terms of its the looseness, if one can put it that way, of its gun laws. So there are cultural differences. But yes, I think we can draw some comparisons and, most importantly, surely learn some lessons for our country where gun control, at least at the moment, is not entirely out of control.
But I guess in the United Kingdom, I mean, I'm thinking of the two most recent tragedies, the Cumbria shootings on the 2nd of June 2000.